Welcome, Urban Fellows. It's great to see you. Constantine was my beloved student, so you have him to thank for this panel because, you know, he did it. You did it all. I thought I'd introduce you to the panel. You have their background a bit because you saw their bios, but I'd like to associate them with these illustrious institutions in this field in Washington, DC. So Joe Parilla is at Brookings. Brookings has been around as a think tank since the 20s, but the Metropolitan Studies Center basically since about 1993? 96, so mid-90s has really been studying and not only issuing reports on all urban issues, publishing books. Your colleague, Bruce Katz, is the author of many that I've actually assigned to my classes. So they've been a player in the conversation. Also, they bring together mayors, people that study cities. So welcome, Joe. Next to Joe, Megan Randall of the Urban Institute. So Megan is particularly concerned with tax policy. Any of you fellows in New York City concerned with revenue tax, any issues like that? Yes, excellent. So you should get together. You know, if you think it's something that is above your head, I mean, I urge you to think again. I mean, this is really where a lot of this decision-making happens. And it's very interesting, this question, and we'll make full use of you today when we talk about incentives. So next to Megan is Sarah Holder from the Atlantic Monthly's CityLab. So CityLab, CityLab would be the newbie institution at the table. I think 3-4 years old. How old? 5 years maybe?
A little bit older than that, but I'm not positive of the dates.
The Atlantic Monthly, though, has been around for 160 years, including original contributors like Ralph Waldo Emerson, if I'm not mistaken. So a glorious history there. And the last but not least is Tom Ikeler, who is our developer. Thank God for you. We have someone who is actually building in the city. So Tom is with P.N. Hoffman. I remember P.N. Hoffman, when you guys started, you weren't with them then. They basically brought in the talent, but I remember when it was Peter Nazarod and Monty Hoffman, and they started developing just north of us up at Logan Circle, housing, yes. Right? So from there, a huge move on. They're the developers of The Wharf in Washington, D.C., which I don't know if any of you have yet been there. It's on Washington Channel, which overlooks the Potomac. And it's a mixed-use development that includes a number of things, a very exciting performance venue, the Anthem, that most people I know who are your ages have been to. So welcome to all of you. So we have a very interesting, rich mix of people talking about Amazon headquarters. So what about these cities that are competing for HQ2? I thought what we'd start by doing, I'll just give you a little bit of a reminder about what this is. This is the next Seattle headquarters, basically. This is not a fulfillment center. I love how Amazon has changed our discourse of shopping. This is the back of house, the big brains over the nationwide fulfillment. Jeff Bezos issued an RFP, a request for proposal, which in itself is very interesting, a corporation doing that. One associates that more with governments, yes. But he issued this in September of last year, very specific about requirements. For example, access to a population center, a cadre of people in a workforce, I have some notes here, that are educated, and looking also for people that are able to provide access to public transit, access to highways, to an international airport. And then to kind of cap it all off, they produced in this actually quite brief RFP that you can Google and find online, what benefits having Amazon HQ2 has brought to Seattle. So mostly quantified in dollars, also in jobs. So the ask of cities is to fulfill all of those characteristics, and then also to be able to provide space enough for, I think it was 500,000 square feet initially. What is the wharf? How many square feet is that? Just as a...
That would be able to be satisfied, but the wharf in total is over 1 million square feet.
Okay.
But we're nearly leased in phase 1, so we only literally have 570,000 square feet that will be breaking ground this summer left for office space.
So that's a good visual for us to kind of keep in mind about what amount of space Amazon is seeking now. And they also want to increase potentially to 8 million square feet. So that's sizable. That's a lot of space.
In any market.
So my first question with that context in mind, just to the panel is, and I maybe looking at Megan and Joe to talk about this first, how did cities get into this business of competing for business like this?
Sure. You want me to start and then you
Sure,
jump
go
in?
ahead.
So, well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. Constantine, appreciate the ability to be here. Excited for you all to be in Washington. This sounds like a really cool program. I wish I could have, partaken in something like this after college. So, your question kind of starts, well, it depends how far you want to go back. But obviously, you can go back thousands and thousands of years. Cities have always been the hubs for commerce, for global trade, going back to the Silk Road. But this modern era of what we would call economic development in the United States was, I trace it back to about 100 years ago, just to put a number on it, when in Mississippi, actually, a town there gave what is kind of maybe known as one of the first economic development incentives. It essentially stole a business from Indianapolis, like a hosiery business, to come to Mississippi. And of course, the U.S. South, in the wake of the Civil War, was slower to industrialize than the North. So it was the southern states that first deployed tax incentives really aggressively. And you can trace this all the way through to kind of big attraction efforts to get auto companies. And this was really a strategy to kind of to seed an industry base and to make up for the fact that those states hadn't invested as much in education or in a workforce. So they used tax incentives as part of this competition. And eventually that spread. So what started in the South eventually became commonplace as companies became more footloose, right? They could move overseas. So what started as a move from north to south moved from south to abroad, and cities found themselves in a situation where capital was really mobile, and you had to provide, in addition to all the things that businesses really care about, which is your talent base, the quality of your infrastructure, the connectivity to the rest of the world, ended up kind of by their own creation, in a way. Governments created this game where they had to compete with one another for investment. And now Amazon is kind of the ultimate manifestation of that. It's the biggest deal we've seen ever in this space. So in that sense, the public, I think, has been awakened to this kind of weird system that the US has that, doesn't exist in Europe. And then Amazon, just by dint of, being Amazon, has kind of blown the doors open on it.
Megan, your perspective?
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. That's a great historical overview, and especially starting at, about 100 years ago, and certainly over the last, century, as we've seen, investments in telecommunications, transportation costs have gone down. You see this capital mobility that you were referring to, and I'll add that, this is part of the policy discussion, not only right at the city level, but at the state level, and I think, with these the increasing capital mobility, what you started to see in the 60s and 70s was a lot of, blue ribbon commissions at the state level, governors very concerned with losing manufacturing jobs, not only globally, but to a neighboring state. And so you sort of began to see tax incentives take a major sort of a starring role in the discussion, so to speak. So you started to have a lot of, for example, business climate indices and rankings started to come out in the 70s. That made states and cities very nervous about how their tax rates, how their business climate was affecting firm location decisions. And, while cities have always been inherently competitive and states and cities are able to compete with each other and lean into their natural and competitive advantages, the discussion began to really focus around how states can sort of tinker with their tax policy and how cities can tinker with their tax policy to attract firms. And so, yeah, it's an interesting discussion, and I think, the data has shown that since the 60s and 70s, we've seen an increase in the use of tax incentives for the purposes of economic development. And if any of you are interested in economic development, I would suggest you check out Tim Bartik's database, where he sort of tracks the value of incentive per job over time. It's been leveling out a bit, but it's interesting to see Amazon as you mentioned, make this sort of process that tends to be very opaque, a very public discussion.
So, and before we get into this question of whether incentives really will work and what the implications are for them and offering them, I'd like to bring the two of you in on this question of who the other actors in this drama are. Namely, are they bystanders, or are they, what is their role? The development community, and then citizens, basically. We were talking a bit in the green room about this question of protest of city citizens to Amazon potentially coming. So do you want to take citizens first, and then we'll go on to Tom with the developer perspective?
Yeah, I mean, even before thinking about citizen protests, I think it's interesting to, just as long as there have been economic development deals being made, there has been this outrage around them. I know that in 1999, for example, Michigan and Ohio were kind of locked in a battle over where Daimler Chrysler would go. And a case made it all the way to the Supreme Court, actually, over whether economic development incentives or tax breaks for companies was even legal at all or constitutionally viable based on the Interstate Commerce Clause. In the end, this case was ruled invalid. Ralph Nader was involved. He did not have standing to take this case all the way to the Supreme Court. But since then, there have been efforts in Congress to abolish these tax races as well, or negate the value of them. For example, there has been legislation proposed to levy a 100% confiscatory tax on any tax breaks offered to businesses by states or cities. So that would mean the federal government would render those tax incentives moot. So again, none of these have been successful to date, and I think that the public outrage has not really risen to the level it has today. But just as long as there have been economic development deals, there has been this public pushback.
Do we have agency as citizens to really do anything about this?
So we've been seeing protests. The Washington DC DSA has been very active in calling on Muriel Bowser to say, obviously not DC, kind of warping her obviously DC pitch for Amazon. And in cities like Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania and Seattle, there have been protests over the past few months over these grand tax breaks that cities are offering to Amazon. But I think without making legislative proposals to include things like, that I'm sure we'll talk about later, community benefit agreements and project labor agreements in these negotiations, there's not really anything that I see that they could do now to stop Amazon from embarking on this grand race, because it's kind of too far gone. But I think that the momentum that these activists have seized upon might change the tide for future economic development deals.
Tom, developers, what are you guys just salivating at the prospect, or are you?
Well, I don't know that we're salivating. I think that in terms of how we look at life, so our core activity is to build within the city and to generate profits for ourselves, but economic benefits for the communities. That has been a guiding principle of ours, which is why we undertook the wharf in the fashion that we did. The sort of economic benefits would have to be rationally assessed, and the packages that would be put together by any winning bidder would have to make economic sense to be supported by anyone like us and any citizen that cared about how their governments were using their tax dollars. However, in this particular case, the economic benefits, they're supercharged. Yes, there's always an activist or activists that are against something. We've had projects that have been held up by activist groups that were the minority and the majority was supportive. We had this at the Wharf, which is now widely recognized as one of the most exciting and transformational projects in the city's history. Now, if you want to get a sense of who's winning and who's losing in this particular game, go talk to all of the cities that didn't make the first cut. They're extremely disappointed because they knew that this economic benefit, if they played their economic package rationally, was going to be a huge net benefit for their jurisdiction. I think if you talk to the 20 finalists, and there's a little bit of a blurring of those because 3 of those 20 are DC centric. Virginia, Maryland, and Washington DC are all separately 3 jurisdictions that are being considered. If I believe the analysis that the state of Maryland did when they put together their multi-billion-dollar package and got it approved recently, their advisors, who I'm sure did a fairly good study of this, had forecast about $17 billion a year in net economic benefits once Amazon had fully built out and occupied and employed all of these all of the folks that they have projected that they would employ over time. So $17 billion a year is a lot of benefit against which I think they've crafted a package which is a fraction of that, and that is how they would support it. I have no idea. We have little to no transparency at all into what DC or Virginia, or frankly, most of the other jurisdictions have put on the table. The one thing that we were all chatting in this room next door before we started, for us, because we don't really have everything that we don't own the land that Amazon would be able to utilize for this requirement. A lot of this is just background noise to us. Most people in most of these jurisdictions, most developers like us, they don't have what Amazon is looking for. Our view, the rising tide lifts all boats, and so we would love to see the Washington region, anyone in the Washington region, secure Amazon as a tenant. I will tell you, though, that what we're most excited about is going to happen, has happened regardless of whether Amazon ever lands here or not. And I think Amazon was a primary catalyst for our deficient public transportation system. The Washington Metropolitan Transit Authority, WMATA, since the beginning of time, when they first started running trains back in the 70s, they have never had a defined source of capital flowing into the system. Decades and decades and decades of every year trying to come to new agreements as to whether Virginia would pony up to the level that Maryland and who should be ponying up more. And oddly enough, and I don't think it's coincidental, for the first time in the history of the world, all 3 of these jurisdictions finally, within the last 30 to 45 days, have committed to a sustainable, predictable path to funding of $500 million a year, which I think is also expected to now generate more funding in from the feds. Now that's done, and that was, I think, and others that I've spoken to believe that was a direct result of jurisdictions waking up to the fact that the infrastructure necessary to attract a tenant like Amazon has to be in place. It has to work. It has to be safe. We can't just keep, with our kids, and now I'm a grandfather, we can't give our kids new toys until they pick up the toys and take care of the ones they have. We have kept expanding our WMATA and our public transit system, where the core of it was rotting. And so one of the greatest public benefits to come out of this Amazon surge, I think, for this jurisdiction, is that I think we finally have figured out a way to stabilize WMATA.
It sounds plausible that you could link that, absolutely. The first benefit. What are other consequences that you guys see on the plus and the minus side for this in the DC metro area, and also just for cities in general, at least the ones that have come through this? Does anyone want to kind of run down some of their thoughts about the biggest, baddest consequences, either for good or for ill?
Yeah, I can start.
Yeah.
So I think Amazon's current home, Seattle, proves illustrative here, right? So the scale of, by every indication, Bezos wants to invest at the scale that he's done in Seattle. So what's happened in Seattle? Well, on the one hand, Amazon's footprint in Seattle is simply incredible. They built an entire neighborhood in South Lake Union.
Have you seen it?
Yes,
Okay,
it's
great. Yeah, I haven't.
it's and you look at the before pictures, and it's really quite shocking. So in that sense, like the scale of the investment, I mean, there's very few companies that can transform an American city, but if there is one, it's probably Amazon, just because of the scale that they're talking about. On the good side, it's obviously kind of quality job opportunities at an incredible volume, right? So for folks that don't know, they anticipate investing up to 50,000 jobs at an average compensation of $100,000. So some above, some below. Either way, that is unheard of in terms of these economic development competitions, right? So people, states and cities freak out about 4,000 jobs coming in an auto factory. They freak out over 800 jobs coming into a logistics facility. I mean, it's like, so the scale of this is kind of unheard of on the positive side. On the negative side, you can also go to Seattle. And you ask residents in Seattle, and you kind of say, okay, well, what do you think about Amazon? And a lot of them are like, well, I associate Amazon with higher rents because people are making, a lot of money at Amazon, so they're bidding up the price of housing, and governments haven't responded by building enough. And so working class, lower income households in particular are being pushed out of the city. That's not all Amazon's fault, of course, but people associate it with it. And then the sheer development, the scale of the development required other infrastructure investments, right, around transportation, around other amenities, to your point. And so, you get this kind of tricky political economy where Amazon is a shiny object that gets associated with a lot of benefits and a lot of costs, not all that are the directly result of their activities. And the fact that Seattle hasn't responded with a policy environment, in some ways it's very hard to do because Amazon's grown so fast, but the public policies haven't been supportive of allowing the city to grow either. And it's not just Seattle, it's a lot of cities that are experiencing high growth. They're not building enough housing, they're not investing in enough infrastructure. So, you've got this collective action problem where, you've got a bunch of positives, and the question is who's gaining from that, right? Like it's generally the distribution is not even because Amazon's going to educate people or is going to hire people at a certain education level. There will be some middle skill jobs and other jobs, but the benefit of that $17 billion, we have to be honest about the distribution of that benefit. And the question is, if you're paying on the incentive side by pulling money out of what otherwise would have gone to public goods that would disproportionately have benefited lower and working class households that rely on those public goods, the people that go to public school, the people that take transit every day to get to work, then you're compounding that distribution problem. So I'm not kind of questioning the study. I'm just saying it depends on how the benefits are accruing, and then it depends on where you're pulling resources out to give company-specific incentives, right? If you're pulling them out of, if you're bouncing that out with a tax increase on high-income households, it's a lot different than if you're pulling it out of the K through 12 education system.
Yeah, Sarah?
Oh, yeah, I agree with everything that you said. I would just note that I recently came across an economic study that pointed specifically to that, where if a big company like Amazon comes into a town, the increase in jobs is clear. The number of jobs available for high earners does increase, but along the line, most of that, or a lot of that resource redistribution comes out of K through 12 education, which has really long-lasting negative ramifications for the skill set of your workforce in your town. And of course, that only has negative ramifications if those workers are staying in your city. And so it's not a one-size-fits-all economic study, but I think that really speaks to the idea that, yes, there is a short-term spike in the amount of jobs and the amount of economic resources available to your community, but if you are funneling that money out of K through 12 education, for example, that has a really negative long-term effect, especially on low-income residents who would be using public school resources.
Megan.
Yeah, I think I agree with both of those sets of points, and I think it's interesting because I think what is lacking in a lot of the public discourse, and certainly in a lot of the proposals that were put forward, is a more nuanced view of the cost-benefit analysis. I think the benefits are undeniable, right? And the scale and scope of the benefits are undeniable. But it gets very tricky to measure just distribution. And some of the research on job growth and job growth from these kinds of economic development deals shows that actually 8 in 10 of those jobs over the long term are going to go to people who are moving from outside of the region into the region. And so there's a question of who's getting those jobs, right? Not only within the community itself, but is it really the unemployed folks in that community who are going to take on that work, or is it someone else who already has a job, let's say in San Francisco or Seattle, who's now relocating to this city? And those impose public infrastructure costs. More people are associated with higher education costs, higher public safety costs, more infrastructure use, right? So you need to make those investments as a city, and you will, right? If you have more kids to educate, it's going to cost you more money. If you have more people on your roads, you're going to have to fix more potholes. All these kinds of things that don't always make it onto the ledger when we're talking about the cost-benefit analysis. And that's not to say that all of those costs negate the benefits, right? I don't think they would zero out the benefits in any way. But thinking about strategically how you design an incentive package so that it makes the most sense for a city, and so that a city, as steward of public resources, is thinking about what services is it going to have to provide once Amazon and its additional employees come into the region.
Tom, the private sector and developers specifically, what's your role in responding to some of this question about how you keep up with the needs and keep prices reasonable or affordable, and not displace people or not make people's lives sheer hell because they have to, commute for hours a day? Do developers have responses, that consider these other things?
Well, we have to because our business model depends upon all of these pieces of infrastructure that we're discussing, whether it's public transit, whether it's our public school system, almost most importantly today is affordable housing. Mm-hmm. And so if we're not involved and actively engaged in advancing those in our projects, with our discourse, with community leaders, with city officials, then we're thinking only as far as the next year or two of our business model, and that doesn't take us into the future. So in all of our projects, we are incorporating more so than ever affordable housing components, and we're looking at ways to get much more creative about how we can all work together with our municipal leaders to create more affordable housing. Now, I think that's in almost any major metro area in the states today that is having the benefit of job growth. That is probably the most perplexing. And what is clearly something that whoever is putting these packages together for whatever jurisdiction is at the end game with Amazon, absolutely has to be thinking about, well, it just can't be every dollar of benefit that I'm deriving, I'm handing right back to Amazon. There has to be a net or it doesn't make any sense. And those net benefits have to be very carefully thought through as to what other pieces of infrastructure are going to suffer that need to have this financial support. And that's what this opportunity presents, I think. It's to a jurisdiction. If you can create enough net positive income, you have the ability to really support and add, as they didn't win Amazon yet. We'd love to believe that the DC region does, but I think this infusion of support into the metro system is already an early indication that officials recognize the shortcomings in infrastructure, and they'll be thinking similarly with regard to this net bucket of benefits that come from Amazon. On a day-to-day basis, we, as I mentioned earlier, we're not in there slugging it out and trying to influence our city's posture with Amazon. We're on the sidelines. We very rarely, honestly, this market has hundreds and hundreds of millions of square feet of space. And this is the most rare. This is an extinct species. This sort of thing never happens. We're normally contained in our own little battlefield. We're not competing against other cities. It's all inter-city. Very rarely do Virginia tenants come into the city. It's more likely that a DC tenant might go to Virginia, but we have our own benefits that we have to play, our own toolkit. We have our rental rates. We have to deliver the environment that these great tenants want to occupy. And it's all about talent, and it's all about providing a company with the assurance that they're going to be able to attract and retain the highest caliber of employee, whether they're coming out of school or whether they're whether they're existing employees someplace else that they're trying to build and grow their companies with. So that's our job. We have rent. We have concessions that we offer tenants ourselves. We don't offer them tax incentives because we don't control that, but we offer them free rent. We don't like doing that, but we do. We offer them what are called tenant improvement packages. So they rarely come in and write a check out to build out their own space. That is being done by the developer for the most part. These are usually expensive concession packages that we have to play with. So this takes this in a whole nother dimension with Amazon, where the state governments and city governments are stepping up and trying to figure out how they can enter the world that we're in all the time.
Yeah, it's interesting how this competitive landscape is going. So we're down to 20 cities, right? I mean, 3 or
20
study
sites.
right? 3 located here, 2 not cities because it's Maryland, Virginia, Northern Virginia, DC. And then the usual suspects, Boston, which is, I guess, has the most college-educated folks as a proportion of their labor force, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Austin, LA, Toronto.
Yeah, Toronto's.
The only non-North American city. So, what are these, the competitive lay of the land, what are some of the talking points here, and what are some of the tax incentives that you guys see? And is there anything unexpected or different that kind of crosses your mind, or is it just what you would expect?
I'll just take a first crack at that just because it's a little bit different than what my colleagues here might discuss. I think of Amazon as I'm using some exaggeration here. Global domination, and global domination.
That's their business model.
Global domination.
They
pick a product. They identify a product sector, whatever the inefficiencies are, and they become masters of that domain. And it's thrown them into a regulatory environment that most companies never get subjected to. And so if I go to a sort of a parallel universe example, Google last year, they spent the most dollars lobbying in this city than any other corporation worldwide. And there's a reason for that, because they're being subjected to federal regulation that they are trying to sculpt and craft in a way that minimizes its impact on their business model. Well, Amazon, it couldn't be more clear that the more avenues that Amazon is selecting, notwithstanding what our president says about Amazon and what personal bias he may have against Jeff Bezos, Amazon is into a regulatory environment that they need to think about and influence. And so for them to be here in Washington would be a great advantage to them. I'm not suggesting that the DC metro area has this this procurement in the bag at all, but it's one of the things that would lead someone, I think, like Jeff Bezos, so he's got his beautiful new residence that he's renovating over in Colorado, and he bought the Washington Post. And there is the sort of cloud-based segment of Amazon's business is growing leaps and bounds out in Northern Virginia. Mm-hmm. So there are all sorts of signals like that. I mean, there's signals like that that have been sent into these other marketplaces. But I think the potential influence and the importance of that influence on the regulatory environment as it relates to their business model would be front and center in Jeff Bezos' mind.
So an argument for Washington.
Yeah, I think there are clusters of cities or locations that have particular kinds of advantages. We've been talking a lot about tax incentives. Newark, New Jersey has offered $7 billion. Montgomery County, Maryland, as far as we know, has offered $8.5 billion, and more may be on the table. Places like Atlanta have offered $1 billion, and a lot more proposals have not been released, so we have no way of knowing. There are also some states that have kind of baked in incentive packages, so Raleigh, North Carolina, Indianapolis, Indiana, and Chicago, Illinois. They have pretty substantive economic development packages that their state allows them to offer. In Chicago, for example, they could funnel 50 to 100% of income tax generated by Amazon employees back to Amazon, and that's just allowed. In 17 states, that's allowed. So those are their economic advantages. But there are also like the longtime favorites like Atlanta and Austin, I think, are up there because of their tech prowess and their proximity to a lot of educated workforce. And I've been a DMV stan from the beginning. I think that the DMV has a lot going for it in terms of, you mentioned the data service centers. Ladue County has 70% of web traffic in the entire world goes through data farms there, which I think is a big boon to that location. And cities that you might expect to be front runners like New York or LA have really high housing costs, which I think might be a deterrent, even though otherwise they have great international connectivity, great transportation systems, a lot of educated workers there. But quality of life and cost of living might ultimately be their downfall.
I just want to chime in, and I think it's interesting to look at the cities that have sort of risen to the top of the discussion and the sort of front runner finalist list, just because we've heard this term even in this discussion, the usual players. The cities you would expect to see, the cities with a lot of talent, the cities with great infrastructure, the cities, that have the bureaucratic sort of infrastructure and capacity to handle additional development, additional infrastructure investments, great universities, all those types of things. And I think while many cities have offered very, very generous tax incentive packages, there's at least one or two that are in the top list that have offered nothing. And I know Austin, Texas is one of those. And Texas as a state, might decide to throw in a package. That hasn't been announced yet. But I do think this calls to our attention the possibility that maybe Amazon is making its decisions based on these bigger, more macroeconomic factors, these competitive advantages that cities have built over time and invested in. And certainly, we see new cities, smaller cities might, get into the mix there, and you might see some that are newer that you wouldn't expect. But, when we ask CEOs, firm location consultants, what firms care about when they're making location decisions, it's workforce and it's infrastructure, time and time again. And so it's the incentive portion is interesting, and I don't doubt that Amazon is going to get the best deal it can wherever it wants to go. But it's interesting to see that an incentive package was not required to get into the top of this list. And I'd love to hear also what you have, because I know you've written a couple articles about the city landscape.
Yeah. So when this first was announced, like the reason I'm probably on this panel is I just so happened to write a blog post the day after the Amazon announcement that crunched a bunch of data and then predicted the 20 places that actually had a realistic chance. It wasn't exactly the 20 places that ended up getting on it, but it was pretty close. And that's because of two things. One, Amazon was, first of all, extremely specific in what it wanted, which is a little different just in the context of these deals. Most of them, a company will go to cities quietly and say, they won't even tell them the company. It's usually a site selection consultant that's like, yeah, it's about this many people. They're looking for these energy costs, these infrastructure costs, whatever. So Amazon threw this out to the entire world so everybody could crunch data and kind of make predictions based on the factors that they put out there. And it was just a question of how you weighted those factors. So from the beginning, I thought it was like quality technical talent at scale and then everything else, right? So if Amazon's goal is world domination, then they need the smartest, kind of most ambitious, most driven people in the world to work for them. And I think that comes down to a place that has an elite business school and an elite computer science department, preferably that kind of work together to give them, if the presumption is that HQ2 is about product development and kind of the command and control function for this incredibly large and incredibly complicated company, then I think they're going to put a premium on that kind of elite talent, and then they're going to look for a place that can come to them in a bid and say, look, here are the 10 universities and the 8 community colleges, and we work hand in glove with the K through 12 system to get our talent pipeline right, and we're gonna, we have STEM partnerships that we want to work with Amazon on to get you not just 50,000 workers over the next 5 to 10 years, but then, if you're going to invest this much money, you're going to be here for 50, 100 years, right? So let's get this right. The challenge around the investments on that end, which are hard to coordinate, you got to have your act together, which is why I think they went through this bid process partly, is it's a stress test for regions who kind of have the collective collaboration to make this work over an incredibly short period of time. But it becomes zero-sum at a certain point between investments in those things, which I completely agree with, I think they care about most, and giving them firm-specific goodies to kind of push them over the end. So my sense is they kind of had a short list of 5 in the back of their minds, and they're just using this partly to get a bunch of information for future investments from a bunch of different regions in the country, and then to extract as much from those last 5. And it's kind of ruthlessly brilliant. It's not great for the taxpayer. And if I were talking to Amazon, I would say, look, every dollar we give you specifically is a dollar that we're taking out of the public platform that you need to survive going forward. So I think the people that have done this, in Boston, in Toronto, you mentioned Austin, they basically have a rule that says, if we wanted to do it anyway, let's throw it in, right? If we wanted to put a bunch of money into our universities because we think that's the way that we're going to grow, let's do that with a little bit more intentionality to Amazon. But that, other people, people will benefit from that. Other companies will benefit from that. It'll create a platform that won't just be beneficial to Amazon. And it'll set us up in a position not just to be competitive in the next couple of years, but the next 50 years. So I think that's the places that have done this smartest have had the luxury to do that. They also don't need Amazon, right? Austin doesn't need Amazon in the way that Indianapolis needs Amazon, right? So they have a little bit more leeway.
I also just want to quickly chime in that some of the irony of these bidding wars that can take place, especially around some of these mega deals that get thrown on the table, is that the cities that could, at least on the margins, benefit from So a development like Amazon, like let's say Indianapolis, right, where there might be a higher unemployment rate, there might be higher levels of poverty, et cetera, are actually probably, the least able to have the least capacity to sort of run a competitive bid, or they don't have, some cities that might not have public transportation infrastructure in place, some cities that, might not have a lot of bureaucratic capacity. That's where you're going to get the marginal benefit from investing your tax incentive dollar to create one more job, because that's a person who's not going to have another option. That's a person who's not going to be working otherwise. Whereas if you go to another city that's already more prosperous, that already has all its stuff together, you offer a tax incentive dollar for that job, the marginal benefit is actually smaller relatively, because that person's probably going to be employed and just fine, whether or not Amazon comes in. So there's this irony sometimes that happens with the prisoner's dilemma scenario, where the cities that actually could benefit most at the margin from some investment in this way, and even use of some tax incentives, might not actually be able to be in the running.
I just have a sort of a, we like to think of ourselves as thinking outside the box. This is outside the box. And I still have a little bit of my idealism from my early days in my career. If we were to take stock of really the pros and the cons of having something like this land in your region, and if you were thinking idealistically about what it takes to make cities work well, you might take the view, I'm not suggesting for a moment that the leadership of Amazon would take this view, but you could take this opportunity to negotiate the best possible financial benefit package that you could ever imagine going in the direction of my company, Amazon. And when all the dust settled, you would make your selection. And then you would say to that jurisdiction, I'm going to take some of this for my company, but here are all the things, you're going to take all of these other benefits that you thought that were directing my way. Here are all the shortcomings that we see, all of the negative consequences that need to be addressed by this jurisdiction for us to truly support a sustainable model for our second headquarters in your jurisdiction, whether it's taking some of these dollars and directing them into public education or higher education at this, the public higher education level, or affordable housing. They could do something like that. I suspect it's the last thing that they're thinking about, but it would be another way for a group, if it were truly the case that they are making their selection solely on the basis of the attributes that those regions have that they're looking for, higher education, et cetera, then they wouldn't truly need all of the economic benefits that we as silly taxpayers and being represented by silly government officials might want to throw their way. So take some of that and direct it into what the consequences of, I'm bringing a lot of good, but I know that I also have other consequences that it won't be easy for you to address unless I take some of this, and now I can actually tell you where I want to direct.
So you'd
these
lessen
dollars.
Megan's irony in a way by doing that.
Yes.
I just want to add that those agreements could also come from the city side, even before an agreement is negotiated.
Yeah.
That the city can kind of prioritize whether they want more public housing or more funding for public education or more funding for transportation, and offer incentives, income tax diversions, whatever. But as long as there's a legal mandate in their contract that some of the money generated or that there will be a fund set aside for transit development, for public housing, and that way the city can kind of set their agenda from the beginning.
Well, how will this work? Will cities have the opportunity to insert that kind of requirement or that kind of wish now in the process of negotiation? If Bezos comes and says, hey, District of Columbia, you get Amazon HQ2, can they work this now?
Well, I don't know that they would ever consider doing that. At this particular moment in time, I think they have put on the table what their packages are.
Yeah.
Did anyone at that moment in time make those requirements, or not requirements, but those conditions? I honestly don't know. Now, once these, like any other transaction, You don't want to retrade, especially in such a public. You would never want to be on the side of a transaction where somebody's retrading the deal that you thought you were getting. That would ruin a municipal government's reputation with being able to do anything with anyone else going forward. But whatever they've put on the table, they're going to have to live by. It doesn't mean that if you won or if you were in the short list that you couldn't sit down with Amazon and have that conversation. And your deal is what your deal is, but here's how you would like to take some of that and have it directed into some of these areas that you believe Amazon would put a high value on.
Appeal to his sense of, I don't know,
And
responsibility.
apologies, yeah, there are certainly also, there are structures in place. Whenever I think of incentive deals, I mean, I think, the economist's view is these are a bad idea, right? They're not economically beneficial at the end of the day in terms of the value that you're getting for your incentive dollar, right? Because a lot of companies would pursue this development without the incentive, right?
Yeah.
Regardless of sort of the end number of jobs created, right? Those might have been created regardless of the tax dollars put on the table for them. But at the same time, we recognize that there is real political pressure, and it's difficult when you're an economic development official or you're a city mayor, and you don't want to be the mayor to lose Amazon, right? You don't want to be the city council that didn't even try to put in a bid. And so cities are putting, I think there's a good faith effort to, compete in a way that's good for their constituents. And sometimes I think government officials actually underestimate their leverage a little bit and underestimate the degree to which they could push back a bit and say, no, we're, as part of this deal, you need to create this many jobs, you need to invest this much in, a community infrastructure, et cetera. Or instead of just giving them raw tax dollars, you say, okay, well, actually, we're going to build out this bridge for you, or we're going to, do all this, whatever, site prep for you that has spillover effects for the community, right? So there are ways to structure investment deals that, even if they're not the best, are better, right? And also, two other things that are important when we're thinking about how to structure a good, sustainable incentive deal is transparency. Right now, a lot of the bids are pretty opaque, or we don't know what they are. But at the end of the day, the government has a responsibility to tell its taxpayers where its tax dollars are going. And then also accountability. So making sure that you have clawback measures in there. And this is for any deal, not just Amazon, right? Making sure that if the company doesn't deliver on its promise, that the government has the ability to sort of get that investment back.
Mm-hmm.
Those are great points. The only thing I'd add is it's just kind of a fascinating political dynamic, because if you look at these sites, it's blue cities, right? So Mayor de Blasio is in an interesting position, meaning he's kind of the anti-inequality mayor, and he is staring in the face this pretty incredible deal opportunity. And so how you square kind of what his political base would view this as, factoring in all the costs and benefits, and then you've also got blue cities in red states. So the just the social policies that are being put forward in some of these red state legislatures are not talent friendly. Like you think about the bathroom bill,
Right, North Carolina,
and
exactly.
the fact that employers started wanting to pull out there. So the leverage that this thing has in terms of shifting local and state politics is really interesting.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately everyone will be better served if at the end of the day they can stand up and say, this is a co-investment between public and private with civic support that is going to set a platform for the next 50 years of our city and region. And it's kind of in Amazon would be very foolish to try to just extract everything it could and then be antagonized from the beginning in its community. It just doesn't make sense, because they're going to have to go back and get further things from government and from other stakeholders. So I don't know if that's what they'll do,
Gosh,
but it
I hope
seems
you're right. No, I mean, I
Yeah.
think that's the best case
they may not
scenario.
care. They may just be like, we're
Yeah.
Amazon, we'll get away with it.
I mean, there's some, is there an alternative paradigm to this kind of, I mean, we've talked about some things that could conceivably make this a good deal for everyone. I mean, for Amazon to think about throwing back some of the money into what's needed. The idea that, yes, you'd be foolish to require to basically take everybody up on their, offers and their tax incentives. And is there a whole different paradigm that we're just not thinking about for how businesses can land this kind of, how local governments can land this kind of deal? Or is it just yet to be invented? Or is it impossible for capitalism to come up with any other alternative? I don't know.
I'll take a first shot at that. Like, I do think there's a Hunger Games aspect to this, where as the economy seems to be concentrating, where you've got a lot of resources in fewer and fewer companies that are kind of platforms, right? Like Amazon is a platform, and therefore its reach is incredible, its market power is incredible, and you've got kind of local and state governments that are just acknowledging that they just want a piece of that pie. Like, that growth has to go somewhere, and because it's more concentrated in more companies, it's probably concentrated in more places. And sadly, none of the places that need this investment most are on this short list. Like, the economy is rewarding density and connectivity, and that is only occurring. Only certain number of places seem to have the assets to compete in that world. So what's disturbing about this for the country is that the geography of our economy and the geography of our politics are at odds with one another. So the election outcome was a manifestation of that. So it's kind of to me, Amazon's a little bit of a canary in the coal mine of how just where economic growth and opportunity will continue to concentrate when you're thinking about these kind of elite tech companies that want a lot of talent, that want a lot of scale. Even among this short list, I think there's only 5 to 10 places that are viable. That's, in a country this big, that's kind of a disturbing thing.
On the other hand,
Sorry, that was
no, on the other hand, so my sort of career sort of guiding principles was that I only wanted to develop in the city. I only wanted to build where the infrastructure could support it or could more easily grow around what we were doing to support our impacts. And so the idea of going, yes, infill investment in the close-in suburban areas is also, metro, public access to public transportation. All, we have the ability here in Washington to develop in areas that are served by public transit. Those are all, to me, very, very viable options for my own, the path that my career took. When we take 50,000 people and 8 million square feet and we land, and I'm not suggesting at all that you were saying this, but to be able to absorb that, that's a body blow. It's not a body blow to a major metro area. It's a body blow. All of these impacts, the negative impacts that we all been discussing here this afternoon, multiply them tenfold, 100-fold, if you take that level of transformation and impose it on a lot of these other places in the country where something like this could conceivably go, that are not served by public transit, that are not. We're trying to. I think one of the reasons that cities have evolved so dramatically over the last 20 years. I mean, when I came to Washington in '84. The lights were off at 5:30 at night in the city. There was no residential development in the city, believe it that or not. New York City was always blessed with the 24-hour 7, but most other cities were not, Washington included. The transformation of most cities in the world today has been an influx of people discovering how wonderful it is to have this sort of self-contained ability, the sort of, I know there have been studies about innovative thinking and all the sort of great things that come from being in a denser setting like our cities. So to take all of that and scrub it and say, well, let's go back to the old suburban model and let's get back in our
IBM
cars.
in Westchester County or whatever.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, and then we're back into an automobile dependency that we're all trying to move away from. I think it's a great thing for a big user to Amazon to have isolated itself or really zoned in on the cities that have infrastructure that can better support their impacts, better deal with their impacts.
I think all of those are such great points that both of you mentioned, and I want to chime in a little bit about your prompt to think about what does an alternative look like, right? What is the alternative to the Hunger Games? And as we mentioned, there are a lot of political pressures and real economic pressures that are at play. So I don't know how likely it is for this alternative model that I have in my mind to sort of really thrive. But our team has been doing a little bit of research lately on local economic development collaboration models. And so this has less to do with sort of the mega deals of the world, right? Those are these sort of oddities, and that can't be really contained with any or classified with any sort of consistency over time. But there are government officials who work in specific jurisdictions who recognize the value of regionalism, and it's attractive to them. And they realize, especially in a global economy where capital is footloose, they want to collaborate with others to develop their regional capacities, their regional competitive advantages, whatever those might be, right? And some of them, especially if you're a smaller or mid-sized city, you realize you can't do it alone. And so thinking about economies more regionally and trying to limit sort of the desire to poach or the desire to sort of, sort of the Kansas City, phenomenon of we'll just get it over the jurisdictional line and, we'll get that tax revenue. Starting to think about how we build regional advantages collaboratively. And there's a bunch of different models for doing this. I would say it's not common, but I think that there's an appetite for it if it were to be nurtured. And, there are things like revenue sharing programs. There's an interesting model in Montgomery County, Ohio, where they actually have a grant program combined with a revenue sharing program. And so in order to get these economic development grants, and it's a small program, it's a little bit of small beans compared to something like Amazon, but in order to get these grants, you actually need to say that you're going to participate in revenue sharing with the region. And so at the end of the year, the high growth, high capacity jurisdictions actually share some of their revenue with the lower capacity jurisdictions, but they all get sort of the carrot is this grant pool, right? And so that's just one model. There's several other different ways to think about building cultures of collaboration and social norms where, mayors trust each other, they know each other. And so not feeling like you're competing with your neighbors so ruthlessly. And it'll be interesting, especially to see what happens in the DMV area, because there's such the potential, I think, here to think regionally, but we have so many jurisdictional lines and interests that are competing for that investment that it just makes it it'll be interesting to see whether we approach it in the Hunger Games way or whether we decide we're going to think a little bit more as a region.
Well, with that, I'd like to open it up to you guys and your questions. Does anyone have you want me to pass you the mic? Yeah, why not? Oh, Polly, thank you. Polly's coming with mics.
Is this on?
Yeah.
Okay.
We hear you.
Perfect. Thank you. This is very interesting, so thank you for the conversation. And I understand a company like Amazon doesn't come around often, if really ever. So I'm hesitant to ask it this way, but I'm still curious to hear your thoughts about what kind of precedent this might set of governments or city governments specifically bending over backwards through tax breaks. And I was shocked even to hear about refunneling income taxes back to the company. I think that's reprehensible, quite frankly. But are we moving towards a society in which governments and even more so individuals are going to be the servants to the masters that are big business?
So I think that the challenge is, as you described, is that this is kind of the precedent. Those programs already exist. A business can go benefit from that. The dollar amount won't be as high because most businesses are 500 jobs, and you do that 20 times over a year, you get to a big number. Nationally we provide between 45 and 90 billion dollars in local and state tax incentives. So these all add up, but they're not these big public shots. So I think I would agree exactly with what you said, is it's shifting the norms of what job creation policy looks like in the United States, right, at the local and the state level. And It's acknowledging that net job growth comes from typically a bunch of companies growing unnoticeably to any public official. And so the political incentives are to cut the ribbon. That's the challenge with these programs. Like, at the end of the day, I think that a lot of this is about political and institutional incentives. And even if you can convince them that there's a better way to grow your economy, it's hard for them to, first of all, that probably doesn't occur within their political cycle. And then second of all, it's hard for them to go and show to the public that what they're doing is benefiting them in the way that delivering Amazon would. So I struggle. And then the final point is just that costs money up front typically. So to do big infrastructure investments, to do education investments. So we need more creative financing vehicles that allow for the reason incentives are attractive to politicians is they're deferred, right? Like the next guy sees any sort of pain from that and you get to cut the ribbon. So you have to find a way to align what you were talking about with really smart policies with the political incentives. And that's what we spend a lot of time thinking about, actually, is how you deliver this stuff on the ground, because you have to overcome those institutional barriers.
I would also say that I wouldn't judge Amazon in the context of 99% of what else goes on with company relocations. Amazon should be considered an outlier. This is an extraordinary event in the history of the U.S. economy, that someone as large as Amazon would actually be in the market like this. It hasn't happened before. And concurrently with what Amazon is doing, other massively successful technology companies, which seem to be sort of the engine behind where these very large space requirements are coming from. Apple, Tim Cook, has publicly stated that he's in the market for HQ2, and his process isn't going to look anything like Amazon's. And all we know is that he's having private conversations, or his team is having private conversations with cities around the country that he's probably targeted, and that whatever that end game looks like for Apple is going to look a lot different than what is happening with Amazon. I think the jury is out right now. I wouldn't prejudge what the end game with Amazon is going to look like. We know everybody wants to play the game. I mean, everybody has gone to Vegas and they've got their best hands to play with Amazon. I'm not going to prejudge what Amazon decides to do with this outcome that they're offered. So I'm going to not try to go there. Google is expanding in a completely different way. So Google's footprint in New York City is expanding. You guys know, is expanding. I don't know what the incentive packages are, if any, that the city's offered Google. But they're expanding in a completely different way. It's rather organic. I mean, they took their one big stake position and they keep growing in the Chelsea Market area, right? And they just bought their headquarters, or where they had been using as their East Coast headquarters. And I think there's probably more expansion there to come. So I wouldn't, like any trends can be judged when similar sized things are occurring on a regular basis, and the next deal looked like the last deal. This is such an outlier that I wouldn't lose faith in government officials' ability to determine the difference between an Amazon and the next larger, 200,000 square foot corporate relocation comes along.
Does it on? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
So first of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm a Washington, D.C. resident. I've had the pleasure of being a community activist here in Washington. I've dealt with P.N. Hoffman. Of all the companies I've dealt with, the best company to ever deal with when you live in a community and they come to build in your company. I just want to
Thank you very much.
I've met Monty. You could tell him that I said so. But the most recent comment about revenue share, it seems to me that when this area put in a bid for the Olympics, they agreed to a revenue share between Maryland, D.C., and Virginia. And they did not get the bid. But that's, to me, that seemed like the model that we should be moving forward. But as far as the political will to give tax for Bezos or anyone else going forward, we could take a look back at what we've done in the past here in DC. We lost the Redskins to PG County because the political will wasn't there to give the tax to the then owner, and PG County did. We forced through tax revenue for the current stadium where the Nationals currently play, and you can argue whether or not that panned out. I've seen no numbers on what's there. Maybe it's too premature. But then the soccer stadium came along and the will was even less, and a lot of people raised their hands and said no. The Redskins will not come back to this city because no one's going to give them, or the city, there's no will to give money to the Redskins to move back into the city. I think that Amazon needs to look at this area as a whole and then give money, seed money, to build the infrastructure, not necessarily at 800,000 square foot. I mean, it's a platform. Their employees could be stationed anywhere in this area and still, as we all do now, work from home. I'm working right now. So, but my question is the revenue share. I would love to hear more about that and how that would work with an Amazon or even with a Redskins or with an Apple or someone like that, because more companies are going to that model where all the employees don't need to be in the same place to actually do business. Thank you.
Sure. So there's a bunch of different models out there for revenue sharing. Again, collaborative economic development policy is not the norm right now, but there are some examples in some places where we see cities engaging with each other in these ways, and where revenue sharing policies are in place. I would have to, and I'm happy to provide follow-up materials if people are interested in learning more about these models. I don't have all the details available to me, but as with any policy, there's good design and then there's less effective design, right? And so there have been some revenue sharing models, for example, I believe in Wisconsin, where it's actually was mandated by the legislature that certain hub metro cities would share with some additional communities, and it wasn't really enforced. It wasn't really very effective. It didn't really have the outcomes they wanted. There are other models, like I said, where overcoming the political sort of animus toward sharing revenues with other places is overcome by offering a carrot, right? Offering participation in a grant program. Sometimes it's not just governmental entities that can act in this manner, but economic development corporations can sometimes help broker these types of agreements, help encourage additional collaboration between communities, because if you're part of an economic development corporation, you are seeing each other regularly, you have active resources available to help you think about the region, market yourself as part of a region. So there's definitely models, and I don't know if other panelists have seen some different things out there, and I'm happy to provide some follow-up materials for folks as well.
Let's have another question. I think we have time for a couple more, so why don't we, front row.
Hi, thank you for the panel. I was wondering if any of you have thought about Amazon as sort of a homogenizing and displacing force. I mean, obviously Amazon is going to keep doing its global domination thing wherever it locates, but in terms of dropping 8 million square feet, what effect that can have on the built form of the city, and then also having 50,000 highly educated tech-oriented workers join the city population, like how that affects who lives there.
Okay, well, I'm making stuff up here. Let's see. I think it's a concern. I think one of the reasons that these tech companies are coming east is to escape that very environment that you're describing. I think they want to have exposure to other ideas that being amongst themselves. I had a couple kids that have lived out in the Bay Area, and one went to school out there, and their friends are this living in the city and commuting out to Silicon Valley, and how these, sort of from an urban planning standpoint, as progressive as I always thought California would be about things like that, these campuses for these big tech companies are these bubble worlds that they live in. It's company town. They go to these places, they almost live in them. There are models now. I think who is it that has in Mountain View a new campus that is also going to contain all the housing for, I can't remember which tech company that is right now, but there is this sort of bubble mentality of like a single way of thinking about things that I think they're escaping from. I would like to believe that the major metro areas that they're looking at on the East Coast and elsewhere in the country and in Canada are already so diversified from an industrial base that all of this free-form thinking already exists, and that as large as Amazon is, they really pale in comparison. If we have 8 million square feet of Amazon space ultimately occupying an area here in Washington, D.C., it's a fraction of the hundreds and hundreds of millions of square feet that exist here. So I don't think their incursion into any major metro market area begins to set the tone for an Amazon company town. I don't believe that's the case. I do think they see huge benefits. I think that's why Apple's looking. Google went into New York City. There would be, you'd have to. There are other ramifications that you're describing to us that I frankly would just have to think more about. But I don't fear that. I don't fear that at all, just because of the scale of what we have already become in most of these other major metro, where they already stand with their diversified populations.
Well, I think it's funny to think about tech companies like Amazon moving away from San Francisco or trying to escape this culture, but by them moving there in the first place, they were the ones that kind of created this culture. So I think it makes sense to think that maybe 10 years down the line, the host of an Amazon HQ2, if all of the economic ramifications that we are hoping for follow, it could be the next San Francisco. And obviously that's all conjecture, but if you are investing billions in a tech campus in a city, I think what cities are hoping for is more tech companies following. And if that happens, I could see similar trajectories as a lot of places in the Bay Area. And I think Brookings actually had a great study recently about how an Amazon HQ2 would affect housing rates in different contender cities. And I think it's not evenly distributed. There's some cities like Indianapolis, as we said, maybe needs the economic boost more and possibly would not win it. But they have enough room to grow, and they're not so dense that an Amazon HQ2 would displace as many residents as they would in Washington, DC, for example. But as we've seen in Seattle, rising housing costs affect an entire city and disproportionately those who can't afford to live there in the first place, which leads to longer commutes and I believe a homogenizing force on the city.
So a few cities were mentioned that putting, I guess, RFPs or putting applications, but didn't include any tax incentives in their packages. And I was wondering if any of you could talk to whether you saw a trend in those cities that didn't put in any tax incentives.
So the two that I'm most aware of are Boston and Toronto. So some of the bids haven't been disclosed yet, so we don't know we presume if they haven't been disclosed, it means that there was incentives. And Boston did put forward some incentives, as did Toronto, but they were very small comparatively. So if I can extrapolate from those two places, I would say that they had a starting point that allowed them to essentially lead with the assets that they had already invested in, whether that was town or infrastructure. And Boston, like Harvard's an asset that's been there for 300, 400 years. So if you have those things, they've been invested over centuries, then you may not have to put as much forward on the incentive side. I also just think like they were in Canada. I mean, the U.S. is different in this space. So just the fact that one is Canadian, I think, is illustrative, where they just don't lead with tax incentives in the same way that American jurisdictions do. And the fact that Boston had been through the Olympics, I think, mattered. That there was just not like, I don't know if you followed that, but basically they applied for the Olympics and Boston was like, we do not want this. And obviously Amazon is a much better opportunity from like an economy standpoint than the Olympics, but it might just be also something about Boston.
I will say with Boston, it's interesting because it was just last year that General Electric broke ground on its new headquarters, and basically, the narrative was that Boston had lured GE away from its base in Connecticut with a pretty generous tax incentive package that had both incentives from the city as well as from the state. And, as far as tax incentive packages go, I mean, it was huge. It's a mega deal, but, it was transparent. Taxpayers could see what was in it. There were some, community infrastructure sort of focused investments that might have some nice spillover effects for folks. There's good accountability measures. As far as tax incentives go, it wasn't the worst of the worst, right? That being said, it was 2 days after they broke ground on this big deal on this headquarters that the CFO of General Electric was quoted in the Wall Street Journal saying, "We didn't come here because of the tax incentives." He was very explicit. He said, "Yeah, it was nice that we got some incentives. We wanted to get the best deal we could, but we came to Boston for the educated workforce. We came because it's already an industry hub. We came because of its great infrastructure." And so it's funny, in some ways I feel like, economists, we like to, not that I'm an economist, but I hang out with a lot of economists, and we like to run around in circles, sort of chasing our tails with how to design the perfect econometric study to prove that tax incentives aren't really working. But you can just read the Wall Street Journal, and
They tell you.
the CFO will tell you the tax incentives are not why we came here. And so, yeah, I think it takes a little bit of, I don't know if it's a cultural thing or maybe Boston felt like it was a little bit, it's like, we just did this with GE. We don't want to do this again. It's hard to say, but I mean, I know Austin also did not offer any incentives, and I think there is a burgeoning culture among some cities to have that pushback and say, no, actually we're a pretty great place. If you want to come here, these are all the assets we can offer to you, but we're not going to give you the same goodies that we've been giving away for free for so long. I believe they did offer some, but I'd have to go back and check.
Yeah, I'm not sure they've been released. Publicly, actually, for the New York City. For Newark, they did, but not for New York City, I don't think, at least that I've seen. They did?
Well, we are 2 minutes of 3. Can you make it really quick?
Yeah.
All right. Super quick. Super quick question, super quick answer.
Yeah, sure. So I know that the site selection process at this scale is really unprecedented, but I also know the idea of a super huge and hugely successful company in a geographic region or city isn't. And I also know many of those have failed and left cities sort of in the lurch. I'm thinking about Detroit or Gary. I'm wondering about how cities in this proposal process have thought about failure, and how can they think about failure, and how that might impact their city.
Well, you mentioned earlier this concept of clawbacks. So clawbacks are essentially tying the incentive to actually fulfilling the promises of job creation. So you don't get the incentive until you actually do what you're supposed to do. But I think you're almost asking a longer term question, right? So, Detroit at one point was the Silicon Valley of the United States, and it became over-reliant on one industry. That industry couldn't see around the corner, and it was, for a lot of other reasons that followed that, it decimated the city and the region. There's a lot of people that posit that is where we're in an era around information technology that was where manufacturing was, a century ago, where you had this need for really a lot of co-location to do the innovation that requires, it, but eventually it'll become routinized. And they'll look for lower cost options, and the industry will decentralize as these places become really expensive. So What that means for this investment, I don't know, but it is kind of this big, and how quickly it occurs. I mean, this could be something that takes decades, if not a century, to play out. My guess is in the kind of thought processes of elected officials and the time cycle that they're thinking of, they're probably not taking that point into consideration, but I think it's a really interesting one.
I'd just say quickly, Foxconn, when Foxconn went to Wisconsin, they offered $4.5 billion. Foxconn has a pretty clear history, in China at least, of failure or rescinding from investments, and they still offered a lot of money. So I think that just adds to your point. I mean, they hope that it won't fail.
Well, here's to not failing. Thank you, panel. Very stimulating discussion, and thank you guys very much. Great questions. Appreciate it.